Welcome to, I believe, the fourth series, the 4 of 5 of the North American 3Rs Collaborative webinar series. Today, we're going to be focusing on culture of care, and I'd like to welcome Beth Greenhoff, who's an associate professor at the University of Oxford. One of her research interests is about the relationships between humans and the research animals they work with. And like I said, today she'll be presenting about the importance of culture of care for compassion fatigue resiliency, including a really awesome interactive research that her and her team have developed. And with that, I'll hand it over to Beth.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much to Megan for the invitation to share our work with you all, and to all of you for joining the webinar today. As Megan said, my name's Beth, and I'm a social scientist who works on workplace cultures and human-animal relations in animal research, mostly focused in the UK, but I think a lot of what we're finding here translates really well to what we're seeing in the States as well. And with me, I have Hiba Mazhari, who's a DPhil student and also one of my research assistants for this project, who's going to be helping me out because now I've shared my slides, I can't see the chat. So Hiba, I didn't warn you of this, but I might well come to you to tell me what's happening in the chat. So the main focus of today's webinar is to think through this idea of a culture of care in animal research and how this relates to compassion fatigue. So I'll begin by thinking more broadly about what is a culture of care, and I'll give you a brief insight into some of the work my team's been doing to look at workplace cultures around animal research. And then in the second half of the webinar, I'll give you a look at one of the resources that forms part of your culture of care pack. And it's called Careful Stories, and it builds on some of that research to develop a tool to help people have conversations around developing a culture of care in the workplace. So just to give us a quick overview, we'll begin by thinking about what is a culture of care. I'll talk about my research, as I said. I'll introduce the Careful Stories resource, and Hiba and I will also demonstrate that for you. The resource works around using scripts or mini role play exercises, so we're going to perform one of those for you and get your feedback on it. I'll tell you a little bit about how it's been received in our pilot study so far, and at the end I'll touch on some of the other resources that form part of the Culture of Care pack. Okay, so first question, what is a culture of care? So I'm going to throw this question over to you for starters. So what does the phrase culture of care mean to you? I'm going to open that up. Please feel free to type your responses, no more than 3 words, so keep it brief, into the chat. What does the phrase a culture of care mean to you? And Hiba, if you can, tell me a little bit about what's happening in the chat.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Any thoughts or ideas? What's a culture of care about in the relationship to your workplace? How do you know if you've got a good culture of care?
I'll just wait for a few more entries to come and I'll summarize them. So, okay, so one of the themes coming up so far, which it is not just care for animals, but care for animals and humans, caring for all, care for people. We've got some themes around communication, some people talking about open and honest conversations, support, also importance of science, because somebody says prioritizing animal and research health. So there's this idea that it's good for the research, not just good for the animals, caring for each other, positive caring attitudes. So this, so those are the themes so far.
Brilliant, thanks so much. That's really encouraging because that very much corresponds with some of the things I wanted to talk about today. So it's good to know we're all on the same page. And thanks so much for joining in and feeding into the chat as well. And thanks, Hiba, for summarising those so well for us. Okay, so my own sort of understanding of the culture of care, and if I tried to trace its history in the UK where I work, we can often, or people tell stories about how they trace it back to a series of scandals in the healthcare sector, investigations into malpractice at the NHS Mid Staffordshire Health Trust, and a whole series of sort of concerns that hit the media which drew attention to seemingly uncaring workplaces. and suggested that there was in society more broadly unease about the cold forms of care that seem to characterise institutional settings. Put really simply, there was a feeling there was a disconnect between the physical labour of providing care, say feeding, watering, providing pain relief, and the more intangible aspects of caring about, feeling responsible for, taking an interest in, empathising with. And this led to a series of interventions in sort of designed to promote a culture of care within institutions such as the National Health Service in the UK, and similarly within the animal research sector, where again a series of prominent care failings, which were reflected in the media, led to an increasing emphasis on the need to develop a good culture of care, alongside a very long-standing commitment to the 3 Rs, to reducing, refining and replacing the use of animals in research. Alongside this, as I think we've seen really well with this compassion fatigue initiative, there's been a growing concern both internally and externally about the emotional labour experienced by those who work in animal research, the sense that you have to hide your feelings perhaps in order to look more professional, and about compassion fatigue, as we've been reflecting on through these webinars, and how this is experienced by those who provide care for laboratory animals. A good culture of care today, I think, is increasingly widely recognised, both in the UK, internationally, in the US as well, as being key to the welfare of both staff and animals in animal research facilities, and, as we were saying just now in the chat, to the quality of science produced. Significantly, as again, I think you also highlighted, a culture of care is distinctive for an emphasis on laboratory animal welfare. So it's not just about care for animals, it's also about care for co-workers and towards wider institutional structures, practices, cultures and objectives. And the definition I most usefully or tend to fall back on is this one provided by Sally Robinson and colleagues in a recent report, where they talk about how a culture of care involves going beyond just complying with legal requirements. It's about caring and respectable behaviour to both towards animals and towards co-workers. And it's also about taking responsibility. How a culture of care is the responsibility of everybody within an institution, both those working directly in studies, but also the responsibility of managers, people working with institutions, biologists, chemists, statisticians, project leaders, and so on and so on. And this culture should instill the sense of responsibility and accountability in everybody involved in implementing research programmes. So it's both an individual responsibility and a shared one. And it also has within it an imperative to continually strive to do the right thing ethically, to always sort of try and go above and beyond, to strive for continuous improvement. So let's break that down a little bit more. I'm going to share with you a list I compiled based on a review of a series of publications on cultures of care that tries to summarise what I think are some of the key themes and elements of a good culture of care. And the first of these, one people keep coming back to, is an idea of strong leadership. So this means that someone with a good culture of care has senior management who are committed to developing and promoting a culture of care, responsible animal use, the 3 Rs, animal welfare, and they have high standards with respect to legal, welfare, 3 Rs, ethical aspects. It also means a senior management and the leadership champion the institution's cultures of care. They have a strong statement of vision, values that recognise and support caring practices. A second key aspect that builds on this then is having a shared institutional vision, which sets out a common set of values and standards. And one of these examples we've included in your culture of care pack, or referred to in the culture of care pack, is one from AstraZeneca, where they have a culture of care pledge. And that's something that communicates their values and their standards around a culture of care. And this is implemented across the establishment. And that then is reflected in the environment in the establishment. So it's having this shared vision that everyone's signed up to. Thirdly, not surprisingly, there's a commitment to animal care and welfare and the 3 Rs. The proactive implementation of things like good experimental design, good care, and within this, a dedication to a learning culture. So there's that sense of striving to improve, regularly reviewing and improving policies to try and improve always animal welfare. Equally, as we said before, there's a commitment to staff care and welfare. So this is about creating an inclusive culture and a culture that's mutually supportive. This is about demonstrating empathy and understanding towards each other in the workplace, something which the resource I'll go on to talk about really tries to do. and having appropriate mechanisms in place to support staff well-being, good support structures, places people can turn to if they're struggling. It also involves respect for the fact that people have sometimes different values and different ethical perspectives on animal use, and is open to giving people the space to think about and express and hold those different perspectives. There is, as I mentioned in the definition, a recognition of both shared and individual responsibility. And this means we need an effective operational structure. So there are clear roles for people, responsibilities are clearly allocated, everyone knows what their responsibilities and tasks are. And people are prepared to listen to and support them in carrying out those responsibilities and tasks. There's a respect and a recognition for both shared responsibility and individual responsibility when it comes to animal care, welfare and use. Training, competence and continuing professional development. So really good, strong training framework so people can feel that they're supported in improving animal care. If there's that drive to constantly strive to do better, then hand in hand with that goes a good training and support structure with adequate opportunities, that's well resourced and that engages with the latest developments in animal welfare science and experimental design. I think this one's really important. Not only do we have these structures in place and these aspirations when it comes to a culture of care, but we recognise and reward when people do them well. We recognise and reward good practice. So this might involve programmes within institutions that recognise achievements in the 3Rs or achievements in providing excellent care. So, for example, one of the establishments I work with had a certificate that they used to give to groups that managed to reduce the breeding of their animals, so had innovations toward breeding, recognising and rewarding good practice. Empowered staff. In the chat, people mentioned communication as a key issue. And alongside that is staff that feel empowered to speak up, that feel they're respected, they're listened to, they can come forward with any concerns or congestions they have to improve animal care. And the ethical oversight committees are similarly empowered. They're well supported in their review of scientific work and they're able to take a thoughtful and rational approach. An ethical review can be a really challenging environment for everyone involved. It's a space where in the past, some of the places I've looked have seen miscommunication. There can be issues with hierarchy or a sense that for some researchers, when they go up before ethical review, they feel like they're running a gauntlet. So how can we create more open, communicative, supportive animal welfare oversight committees so they feel empowered to do their job and people feel confident in sharing their research with them and know they'll be supported as well. So these all come down to, of course, good communication, mechanisms to support open communication between different research programmes and between staff at all levels within an institution. And again, this is something, the resource I've been working on, to really trying to work on. How can we get people who work in very different ways or at very different levels within an establishment to get together to talk about what's important to them when it comes to a culture of care? A commitment to openness and honesty. So I think one of the challenges we talked about in relation to compassion fatigue is not feeling able to talk about what you do and share what you do. And one of the ways we can support this is through a commitment to be more open and honest and to feel that this is something we can talk about in the public domain. And then last but not least, a commitment to a culture of care isn't just about looking what's happening within your institution, but also thinking about taking that into account when working with those outside the organisation. So thinking about the standards and the culture of care with the suppliers you work with the organisations you work with your research partners. How can we share best practice across our wider community? Okay, so that was a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. I've tried to summarise it on the slide here for you now in my flower diagram. But if we just take another pause here, looking at that list of elements I've just gone through, can you see anything within this sort of wider sense of a culture of care that might help promote compassion fatigue resiliency? So I'm just going to pause for a moment and again invite you to type your thoughts into the chat. Just 2 or 3 words. What of all the things I've mentioned do you think might be most important when it comes to promoting compassion fatigue resiliency? And here I'll let you to shout out when we've got some responses.
Yeah. Again, I'll wait for a few more to come in before summarising what's the most common. So we've got a couple of, again, the same theme of communication, strong leadership, training and confidence, training competence, CPD, more on communication, a few people talking about the importance of individual and shared responsibility, specifically for senior researchers or non-animal users, empowered staff, rewarding good practice. Yeah, and I think that's everything.
So it sounds like we pretty much want it all. There's a challenge, but it's interesting. I think people do have different priorities.
We've also got a new one, a strong feeling of belonging, which is a good one, I think.
Yeah, it kind of picks up on this idea of shared responsibility, or a sense that you're all in it together, which is again about building those good relationships between all the different staff and all the different roles within an organisation as well. And I think the idea of a shared institutional vision feeds into that too, a set of values that defines our culture of care we can buy into. Hi, did someone jump in there? Oh, okay, brilliant. So how does this relate to compassion fatigue? I think we've had some really good ideas there. There's a really strong sense that a lot of what I've been talking about does feed into compassion fatigue resiliency. Particularly, a culture of care can play a role in recognising both research animals and people are intertwined, and compassion fatigue can worsen when people don't feel there's continual improvement. So the sort of push for a culture of care to constantly strive to improve is important for helping to prevent compassion fatigue. Communication, and in particular communicating the results of work. One of the things I constantly hear from people who particularly work in animal care roles is that what motivates them is a sense that they're doing things towards a greater good. And if they never hear back the results of particular experiments, that can really lead to feelings of frustration and compassion fatigue. It can also involve, a culture of care involves recognising and rewarding staff, providing development opportunities, all things that help people thrive and feel positive about their work. And then organisations with a strong culture of care recognise the importance of supporting staff. And this, again, as we've said, shared sense of collective responsibility, thinking about the well-being of everybody, both staff and animals. So a lot of common themes there, and I think a lot of ways in which developing a good culture of care can help prevent compassion fatigue emerging. Okay, so in the next section of this webinar, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an insight as to how I come to think about this topic. I'm part of a group of researchers called the Animal Research Nexus in the UK. And we use the tools of social sciences and humanities, so things like interviews, observational work shadowing people, looking at the archives around animal research, and even things like art and performance to try and think about workplace cultures and social dynamics in animal research. And one of the things we want to do with our work is try and generate new cultures of communication in the animal research world, and hopefully through that contribute to better welfare for both humans and animals. And this is why I think our work aligns so strongly with the culture of care. What this means in practice for me and my team is that we spend a lot of time listening to the stories told by people who work in animal research, and then we bring them systematically together to look for shared themes, concerns, problems, and solution. And the methods we use to do that are mostly qualitative methods. And I'll just give you a quick sense of the kind of things we do. So first of all, the kinds of research questions we ask are probably very different to a lot of the scientific questions you might be more familiar with in your work. We're interested in how people perceive the world around them, how they experience it, how they understand it. And on the slides, I've just picked out 3 questions from some of our recent research projects. So one of our projects looked at how people just starting out as animal care staff learn to come to terms with how they did the right thing for both themselves and the animals. Another project looked at what happened to workplace cultures when a new species or a new site was introduced to research. What's it like to go from caring about mice and working with mice to working with zebrafish, for example? And then more broadly, we've worked with stakeholders to ask about the kind of questions they're interested in. And one of the things people constantly come back to us with is asking us to try and help them understand what a culture of care is, what it looks like when it's working well, and what factors enable and constrain its development. So the kind of questions we ask are about people's experiences, the things they're interested in, and how they understand the world around them. And we use several methods to try and answer those questions. One of the first methods we used was something called participant observation. And a good analogy for this would be something like work shadowing. It's when a researcher spends time with a group of people they're studying, not only observing them, but actively participating in that activity. So when I wanted to understand what it felt like to be a member of animal care staff, I spent several weeks being a member of animal care staff, cleaning cages, talking to people about their work. It can give you a real insight into some of the issues and concerns that are important to a group. And we use this to familiarise and try and understand the worlds we were interested in. The other key method we use are in-depth interviews. And this is where we really try and work with people, interviewing them often several times over a period of a few years to try and understand their experiences and perspectives and maybe how these change over time. So in one project, we talked to people when they just started out in an animal care role, and then again 6 months later and 6 months after that. It's not about breadth and proportional representation, but it's very much about depth. So, for example, if you're interested in why someone became an animal care staff member, in a survey, you might capture something broad along the lines of, I do this job because I want to work with animals. But in an interview, what you get is a much more nuanced picture. So these are the stories I was mentioning earlier. People told us how they came to work in the particular job, often through the quote on screen sort of reflects someone talking about how they came to this job because they were a dog walker, then they were a kennel cleaner, then they worked in an exotic pet farm. And through this, there's a whole sort of story about how a history of working with animals shaped the way they approach working in animal research. And one of the things we found really interesting is how people draw comparisons with working with animals in other spaces and working in an animal research. And sometimes a sort of sense of satisfaction that they feel they can do a better job of caring for animals in these spaces than maybe in a petting zoo, for example. What we do then is we review or code and label our sort of records of working in places and the interviews, just conversations we have with people to try and identify key ideas. And on screen, you'll see something called a hierarchy map that's generated by one of the programs we use to look for common themes in our interviews. The size of the square indicates how often an issue comes up. And so that helps flag to us what are the key concerns of people working in a particular area. So if that's something about the methods we use, what have these methods told us about a culture of care in animal research? I'll just give you a few highlights. First of all, the culture of care means different things to different people. So one of the things that came up when we did that initial question in the chat, and then when we looked at all the different aspects, is that understandings and what's important about a culture of care varies between people. It varies depending on who you talk to. So in our work, we found that more senior technicians or managers spoke of this in terms of professional standards. So a good culture of care is about good, strong professional standards, a workplace ethic that insists on high standards, or a strong sense of how we do things around here. So this is the culture of care understood as professionalism, happy staff, clean and tidy workspaces. For regulators, in contrast, a culture of care was more about compliance. It was about people and workplaces that comply with the regulation. And then again, for animal technologists, for animal care staff, the culture of care seemed to be more about their care towards the animals, and a sense that this maybe wasn't unique to individuals, but something that was collective or shared. And it's not that any of these people would say that the culture of care is only this, but it says that when we talk about a culture of care, different aspects of that might be more important to different people. A second key thing we learned that, again, I think came out in the chat as well, is of all the aspects of culture of care I flagged, good communication and making sure everyone involved in animal use, care and welfare feels able to share their concerns, their experiences, is an ongoing challenge for some of those, in particular junior staff we work with. So on the screen, I've just put one of the quotes from our work where Carrie's talking about how she says there are certain things that you see and you want to change, and it's like, I want to be able to change it, but I don't want to step on anyone's feet. I find that quite challenging to find where the line is. So good communication is important, but people don't always feel empowered to speak out. There are also pressures that can be obstacles to creating a good culture of care. There are lots of different pressures, I think, for those who work in animal research as in all fields. This could be the funding pressures or the publication pressures that researchers and academics face. It could be pressures for a fast turnaround on an experiment or to use particular procedures that might come from clients in commercial settings. Or there are more general pressures such as staff shortages, or I think the recent COVID-19 pandemic placed a lot of burdens on staff to work longer hours or to live away from home, or even more tragically to cull large numbers of animals as work was delayed or suspended during the pandemic. So these are all examples of pressures that can kind of in turn put the culture of care under pressure. And staff at all levels, from technicians through to researchers through to senior managers, are having to make difficult decisions and perform complex, careful and vital work while being increasingly physically and emotionally exhausted. And again, one of the quotes from our interviews this time from Debbie and Fiona, these are all pseudonyms, by the way, these aren't people's actual names. They're talking about how they've taken on responsibility and were beginning to feel that kind of pressure. And they say it all comes around to staffing. Staffing is majorly important. All that stress being put on you, and then you're making mistakes. We're all human, you feel bad for it. And if I wasn't as stressed, I was concentrating on what I was doing, I wouldn't have made that mistake. Now, without exception, everyone we spoke to saw the welfare of animals as the primary concern and would often put that above their own welfare, I think. But it sort of again reflects the idea that different aspects of a culture of care can be in tension with each other and can come under pressure. And to pick that up a little bit more, the final thing I want to draw out from our research is this idea that different forms of care don't always sit easily alongside each other. So you could work on one aspect of a culture of care and find it doesn't necessarily sit alongside another. And one of the examples I often go to of this is innovations in husbandry practice. So here's Claire on the screen talking about the introduction of individually ventilated cages. I think this is a really good example of this competing ideas of care. She talks about how she prefers conventional caging, so the old sort of mesh caging, to new individually ventilated cages, because it gives her a better opportunity to interact with the animals. She talks about how she can go into the room and she can see them smelling her, whereas there's a sense that when they're in the individually ventilated cages, they're much more fenced off. And I think what's captured in her description here is how individually ventilated cages enable care. They provide better biosecurity for mice, which is good for welfare. There is a reduced exposure of allergens for humans, again, which is good for human well-being. But it also stops other kinds of care happening. Handling animals is often something animal technicians look forward to. It's something that encourages strong human-animal bonds. It's also often a coping strategy. People talked about when they'd had a really bad day at work, they went to cuddle the rabbits, for example. And so these cages put a barrier in some ways to experiencing that form of care. So again, different forms of care don't always sit easily alongside each other, and that can be challenging. How do we talk that through? How do we work that through? Okay, so that was a little bit about the kind of work I do and how that feeds into the idea of a culture of care. We have embedded in the idea of culture of care an aspiration for a workplace culture that places the well-being of both humans and animals front and centre, and some suggestions as to how we might achieve this. Done well, a strong culture of care might do a great deal to help prevent compassion fatigue and burnout by creating a supportive working environment. Alongside this, I found I had a body of research data, a set of stories and experiences collected from people who worked in animal research that gave me a really deeply personal and reflexive account of what working in animal research can be like. And when I talked about the things I'd found out at professional meetings and forums, it was often these quotes and stories people shared which resonated the most, and in turn, often unprompted, encouraged them to share their own experiences. So what I was seeing is by sharing the things I'd found out in my research, by sharing people's stories and experiences, it opened up a very different kind of conversation to the one we might usually have in a professional animal research environment. And I use this as inspiration to try and develop a new training resource, which again forms one of the components in the Culture of Care pack. So why careful stories and why tell stories? Well, as I hope is becoming apparent from what I've talked about so far, the culture of care is complex and multifaceted. And that means it can be quite hard to teach. It's not something that, even though I'm trying to do it right now, can easily be put just into a series of PowerPoints. And I think there are other challenges as well. There's a lot of training already within animal research, focusing on things like looking at key ethical issues, meeting regulatory requirements, developing competence and practical skills. And often that's a training curriculum that's quite crowded. It's a working day that's quite crowded. And that means creating the kind of spaces where people can really go into depth and talk openly about questions like what is a good culture of care and how it can be put in practice is actually quite challenging. Furthermore, I think regulation in animal research tends to focus on care for the animal, but often fails to address issues of care for staff. Although, as we can see exactly with, again, the Compassion Fatigue Initiative, this is changing. This is further compounded by, given the nature of work, people often don't have space to talk about what they do outside the workplace. So again, those conversations where we work through difficult issues or challenging aspects of our work that you might have down the pub with your friends or in social situations, I think are harder to have when you work in a sector like animal research, which can provoke quite strong reactions from people. So this to me all suggested that moment I had of sharing stories, which in turn encouraged other people to share their stories, could give us a new way of teaching a culture of care, could be a way of starting some of those conversations. So I was lucky enough to secure some pilot funding from the University of Oxford and from the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK. And I was also very lucky in having an amazing group of collaborators from across the UK animal research sector, from both private and public institutions, NGOs. And we worked together to develop this new training resource that's designed to be delivered by any competent trainer to help people working in animal research reflect on, participate and promote a culture of care in their working environment. And the object of the project was to use the idea of sharing stories as a basis for this training resource. And the idea is we'd create a series of fictionalized stories, little plays or role plays we're going to demonstrate in a minute. And when we put these out there, this in turn would encourage people to share their own stories and to talk openly about experiences, meaning, values and practices, to talk about what they think a good culture of care is and how they might share it with their community. And what we hope we're producing with this project is a set of training materials, some evidence on how effective these training materials are, and a report that we're sharing through initiatives such as this one. Okay. So we have had a series of development processes, we ran some workshops, we looked at current training provision, we identified some key learning outcomes for our exercise, and then we had a great time working with a professional scriptwriter to develop a series of mini plays or fictionalized scenarios. And we're piloting these at research institutions across the UK. And again, they're going to form part of your Culture of Care pack as well. The kind of things these resources can help promote, or the kind of learning outcomes that these resources can deliver, are helping people appreciate some of those diverse understandings of care and how care for humans and animals in facility can mean different things to different people. It gives people a chance to share examples of positive workplace culture. It's the kind of conversation that can help us think about both shared responsibility and individual responsibility. It can help us reflect on how we best promote effective communication. It consider examples of people who feel unempowered and how we might change that. It's about encouraging respect for different roles, peoples and priorities. And it's about recognizing what we call the emotional division of labor, or sometimes how some of the most challenging aspects of work might fall not on everybody, but on one or two people, and how we can support them in that. Okay, so our training session, if you like, pulls together a number of resources. There's an example agenda on screen. We often start off with some icebreaker exercises to warm people up. For example, we'll challenge them to draw animals in a short space of time. And the reason we do that is to try and create within a workshop a more informal, more reflexive, more fun environment, encouraging people to open up. We also place a real emphasis on creating what we call a safe space. So we adopt, when we run these workshops, something called Chatham House rules, or the idea you can share learning from a workshop, but we don't share names or details of particular stories people have told us. It's all about creating a safe space where people can open up, knowing that people won't go on to repeat the specifics of what they've said somewhere else. We then use the scripts to provoke discussion, and we might run through 1 or 2 scenarios before having a kind of more reflective and feedback session. Okay. Why use scripts? Well, I think scripts and performance has been really key to this process. It's the thing that this resource does that is a bit different. I think scenarios and what would you do prompts are quite a familiar tool in training precision, but there's something about the exercise of putting yourself literally into someone else's shoes and reading a role that really helps you empathize and understand their experiences. It's also getting people to play a particular role in a scenario helps them recognize different people's viewpoints. I think the best way to demonstrate this, though, is through reading one of these scripts out. So this is where I rope Hiba in to help again, and we're just going to share with you and try and make a bit more concrete exactly the kind of thing we're talking about. So you can imagine we've had a workshop, we've done some warm-up exercises, we've created a safe space, and then in order to get the conversation going, we'd share something like this script. I'd begin by introducing it and tell you that we're in an office. Person A, which is Hiba, hi Hiba, you're still there, is going to be our line manager and researcher, and I'm going to play the role of another researcher coming into the office, and we're going to have a conversation. Okay, so again, we've had the workshop, we've set this up, and then we read through the script to get the conversation going. So Hiba, when you're ready, we can kick off. Hi, sorry I'm a bit late. I was in a meeting with my funders and it overran.
No problem. Come in, take a seat. How are you?
It's been a really rough weekend, actually. I lost my colony of mice, all of them. There was a disease breakout.
Yes, I heard about that, and it's actually part of the reason I've scheduled this meeting. I've had a chat with Jenny and Peter.
Who?
Jenny and Peter? Your animal techs, working with you this weekend, been working with you since the start of your recent project?
Right, yes, of course. Sorry, just a little distracted.
I'm glad they've been working with you. They're very meticulous. I trust them thoroughly with my own colonies.
Yes?
But they were both very upset by the loss of your colony, and connected to that, some of the conversations between you. I've sent them home early today, but...
Look, I'm really sorry about that, but I have huge issues right now, and making sure Jenny and Peter like me is not really at the top of my priority list.
That's not what this is about. They work very hard for you, and me.
I know, it's just I'm under a lot of time and budget pressures.
They said they were happy for me to repeat this to you. They didn't feel you appreciated quite what was required of them, and your stress and attitude seemed to be negatively influencing your interactions with them.
Well, maybe that's true. It would certainly never be my intention to upset anyone. Actually, that leads me to what I wanted to talk to you about. As my line manager and friend, I need your help. I need to get this new colony in and ready ASAP. It's a really short project, and these delays, everything's just piling up.
What are your concerns?
I've already spent most of the time and money on admin and design, and we don't have a lot of room for manoeuvre at the current stage of the project. The animal techs and vet want me to make changes and review and discuss the care plans, and we just don't have that kind of time. I need you to help me get this colony in and get me started.
Presumably, they're just trying to make sure this colony is fine and well taken care of, which helps you, doesn't it?
We're fully compliant. They're taking it too far. We just need to get on.
Were you there?
Where?
When they had to euthanize your last colony?
No, I had other commitments which I couldn't get out of. You can't expect me to be there every time. Would you be?
Not every time, no, but I tried to be present, or at least aware. It's not fair for only the animal techs to have to deal with that kind of things, with that side of things, especially when they're our animals. And if they're just trying to avoid it happening again, then good.
It won't happen again.
I also know they've had a lot of complicated things happening over the last couple of weeks with various groups. Jenny even cancelled her long overdue holiday.
I didn't realise. I'm sorry to hear that. Perhaps I've been a bit caught up in my own stress. I will, of course, speak to them about that. but it's a crucial time right now and it's a bit overwhelming. There's a lot riding on this, so I don't feel I should be dictated to by the animal techs about how I do my work.
They're not dictating.
No, I follow their ideas, I get more delayed and everything falls apart. I don't, and I get a reputation, or more of one apparently. You know, my position is partially dependent on the successful completion of this project.
Yes, of course. Clearly, everyone's upset and stressed for various reasons. What do you think needs to happen for everyone here?
I don't know.
I just feel.
And the script ends there. Thanks so much, Hibba. Okay. So based on sharing that scenario, we then move to a list of discussion points. And to make this a bit more interactive, I thought it would be good to take a look at these in more detail and see what your thoughts are along some of these lines. So again, a question for the chat. First of all, I want to ask you, how do you think everyone in this scenario feels? Again, just pop your responses in the chat. Maybe the name of the person and 1 or 2 words about how you think they're feeling right now.
Just waiting for some responses to come through.
Brilliant, thank you. It could be one of the characters in the script or could be someone else they talked about.
Okay, so we've got some feelings for both parties. So there's overwhelmed, frustrated and sad, unhappy. So I think that's for both. And then there's a specific one for the techs who aren't, well, I mentioned in the script, but not directly one of the roles, underappreciated. There are also some interesting words here: disconnected, unaware. And I think that's probably applying to several people. And stress, again, another theme, continuing the theme of frustration and unhappiness.
Okay, that's really helpful. So what
Pressure.
what this scenario tries to do is kind of bring those feelings and emotions to life, but also I think what was great coming from your comments in the chat is the sense that you can feel that everybody's feeling different things within this scenario. And again, this is what the scripts really try and bring to life. Okay, next question. Quick yes/no question this time. Have you ever been in a similar situation? Have you ever been one of those researchers? Have you ever been that line manager? Have you ever been one of those animal techs?
Just going to try and see if I can do a tally.
This is where obviously this is harder to do in a big webinar like this, but if you were doing this in a workshop more face-to-face, people could be a bit more expansive. And often what's really nice when this workshop works well is people do share similar experiences. Sometimes it's their own experiences or experiences they've heard about, but again, it really opens up some of these conversations. So
yeah, we've got lots of people saying that they've been in similar situations. One person put 3 yeses, so maybe that's a enthusiastic yes, or it's a yes to yes, I've been an animal tech, yes, I've been a line manager, and yes, I've been a researcher. So I could interpret that in several ways, but yeah, quite a few people saying they've experienced something similar.
Okay, I'm going to say it's really encouraging to know this resonates, because it means we've got a potentially very effective resource here. But again, I'm in some ways I'm also sympathetic to be in those situations, because it's not a nice situation to be in. And again, by having some of these conversations up front and making space for them, we can kind of make people more aware of how these situations feel, and ideally work towards not having these kind of situations in the future. So on that note, my next question is, if you did experience this kind of situation, how did you manage it or try and resolve it? I'll just wait a couple more minutes to give people a chance to think.
We've got things starting to come in. I think that the first one is met together to discuss future workable solutions. And I think that's what's come up in when we've previously trialed this script. That's what a lot of people suggested. That was helpful. Okay. Okay, so we've got a few things coming up now. So again, this theme of communication. So some people directly saying communication, some people paraphrasing saying speaking to a co-worker. But we've also got some examples of times when this didn't actually work out. So and the obstacles to this being resolved. So we've got the idea of this taking a long time to do, so hard to resolve with any speed, and the research is likely to be delayed. And the researcher in the script is already stressed about being delayed. We've also got an example of where opening up or communicating didn't work because somebody reacted badly and was angry when this topic was brought up. So that's an example of perhaps not a positive example of communication.
Okay, that's helpful because in some ways it also flags the advantages of trying to have this conversation before you get to that point. Again, something we hope this resource can help people do. And one of the most interesting places I've used this script is on training for new researchers, so people getting their license to do animal work for the first time. And it really encourages them to think about setting up those good communication channels from the get-go. So they have good communication between researchers, between animal care staff, between vets and other named people and roles. And so that the conversation's already happening and so you don't get to this point. So the idea is if you do it in a play beforehand, maybe it'll go better when it comes to it in real life. But again, I can really empathize as someone who's talked to lots of people, those experiences aren't unique. I think the characters in the script are caricatures, but I think they do really resonate with some real experiences as well. So the more we can support each other to talk through these issues and maybe develop ways of dealing with them and setting up better channels of communication, I think is really, really important. My final question to ask you is who, if anyone else, should be involved in this conversation? So in the room, we have just the two researchers talking. If you could bring someone else into that conversation, and who would you bring?
So some of the responses to the previous question slightly address this, but I can start by talking about those while I wait for some to come in. So somebody said talk to a co-worker. So maybe that's to do with somebody who's not directly involved. And somebody else said all stakeholders. So making sure everyone's involved. Okay, so we've got a few things coming in now. So management is an important stakeholder to bring in. Somebody else mentioned managers, and other people mentioning the animal caretakers, the animal technicians, lots of people talking about that, and vets. And then another response says whoever the researcher feels is putting pressure on them. So I think that's interesting because when we've trialed the script before, troubleshooting the researcher B's problems is what's going on, what's the wider context, are there other pressures on the researcher, could we also talk to the funders that are putting pressure on the researcher? So I think that's interesting to try and solve it more holistically.
Yeah, it kind of brings out the sort of tension between what can we do within our institution to try and build a stronger culture of care and a good culture of communication, and what we might need to do in terms of advocacy in pushing for people like funders to take more of an interest in promoting a culture of care and getting engaged and on board with some of these things as well. Brilliant. Thanks so much, everyone, for putting things into the chat. It's really interesting to hear what you make of this and hear how these experiences resonate. Okay, so hopefully that's given you a little bit of a flavour of what we try and do with these scripts. It's to open up these conversations, to share experiences, to share learning, what went well, what didn't work, what we might do better in the future. And then towards the end of the session, we try and bring it together in reflection discussion. So one of the challenges for people who run workshops is what can people take away? How can they take something forward? So we've done this most of the time because of COVID. We've been running these online. So we've used an online whiteboard and people have put post-its against responses. So on screen, there's an example. One thing I've learned from today's session is don't take things personally, talk to animal care staff more. And we can screenshot those whiteboards and give them to people to take away as, again, something to reflect back on. We've also, when we've run these sessions in person, given people postcards that they can fill in and send to their future self. So I think often you can do a workshop, you can have a really interesting conversation, you might spark a really good idea. You think, oh, someone else approached this conversation this way, or someone else set up these weekly seminars where everyone got together. That's a really good idea. We'd encourage you to jot it down on a postcard and send it to your future self. So 3 months down the line, you can open it and go, oh, I remember I had that really good idea. Maybe I can action that now. So we thought about how we can promote people taking the learning away. Again, there's some issues about not, again, sharing too many details of who said what about whom, but how can we take general ideas, useful experiences, inspiration from sharing our experiences forward through something like an online Jamboard, an online whiteboard, or through postcards. Okay, so in the last few moments, I'm going to just touch briefly on some of the feedback we've had today, but I'm really interested to hear what you think as well. So I'm going to save some time at the end for questions. So almost everyone that's participated to date in one of our workshops hadn't had much training on the culture of care before, although they had been involved in some meetings and forums. And they really valued in this session the open and interactive communication. So it seemed to be quite effective in breaking down barriers, particularly between people working in different roles. It got junior research staff, senior research staff, animal techs, vets, all in the same room. And it can be quite informal, it can be quite fun, engaging, because it is around these caricatured scripts. So some of the quotes on screen said how it helped them think about different perspectives, think about other aspects of animal research, reflect on different roles and share stories freely. People also said it was useful in giving them new insights or making them reflect more deeply about things they already knew. Someone said it helped things they knew come into sharp focus, trusting the expertise of colleague, thinking about structures for training and competency, or the importance, as we've said all the way through this seminar, of good communication. And it is very useful in helping people see things from the other side, as a reminder what it feels like to be the animal tech or to be the researcher. It broadened people's views, helped them understand how people might care differently, but not necessarily, yes, people have different priorities and different pressures at different points in time. We also had a few things we're working on. We've had to do a lot of these sessions virtually, and I hope from what I've seen so far, they're going to work even better in person. Anyone who's interested can drop me a line and I can share our project report with you, which talks about this in more detail, but you are going to also access some of these resources in your Culture of Care pack. In your Culture of Care pack, you'll also find further tools, things that help you benchmark the culture of care in your organisation, and a whole set of resources there, including some of the scripts we've worked with, but also some websites that have further resources for reflecting on and building a culture of care. Okay, I've talked quite a lot for the last hour, so I'm going to save the last few minutes for any questions. And I'll end my screen now, and feel free to type them into the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them.
You might be able to see the chat now, Beth, but there was a question that came in a few minutes ago, which I think you started to answer, which are, what are the various topics you've developed scripts for, and are these currently available for participants to use?
Okay, so with the Culture of Care pack, at the moment, there's the first 3 scripts we developed. I think first 2 or 3 of the scripts developed, one of which is the conversation between 2 researchers, and another one is between a researcher, a vet, and an animal technician. As part of our ongoing project, we are developing more scripts, one of which looks at wildlife researchers and the experience of working with animals in the wild. Another one looks at what it's like to be an early career researcher. and some of the challenges particularly early career researchers face, and another one's focused on the pandemic and in particular what it feels like to be in a more isolated situation. So what it's like to work in a group that's very isolated from the rest of an establishment. So those are going to be coming available hopefully by the end of the year. Okay, just going to try and open up the chat and see if there are any other questions.
Yeah, and the second script, which is the conversation between the animal tech, the researcher, and the vet, looks at how different roles might see culture of care differently, and also how care looks different for different species. So there's not just so this script that we've just that we demonstrated was just mice, but that other one brings in several different species, so it's quite interesting. We've also got another question here that speaks to story 3, I think, Beth, script 3.
Yeah, the choose your own adventure version. We have actually tried this. This is wonderful in theory, and we've made it work once. It's something that only works well in person and involved lots of envelopes and people pretending to phone each other. Again, you can actually see this in the report. So do drop me a line if you want the report, and you can see the prototype pilot version of that. But we're still working out how best to make that work in practice. Involve lots of coloured printing and envelopes. Oh, some nice comments. Thanks everybody. It's really encouraging to know these are useful and helping people, because that's what it's been very much about for us. Okay, I can see we're almost to the hour, so Megan, maybe I can hand back to you.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Beth, as well as Hiba, for presenting in the webinar today. As I put in the chat, I will be emailing the group leads, but I'll probably just share it with everybody, the packets related to culture of care. So we've got like a variety of resources. We've got one really high-level overview documentation, as well as the scripts that Beth and her team have developed. So you'll get a lot of really great resources. I really hope that you guys will use them. I think that they will be these scripts are an excellent activity for your compassion, fatigue, resiliency committees to sponsor and organize in the coming months, because our next webinar will be in July. I'm just going to look real quick to tell you when it's going to be. It's going to be on July 13th. This time of day, and it's going to be on meaning making, and that will be our final webinar that we're hosting. And so again, after that, it would be great to see the committees yourselves to take these scripts and really use them at your institution. So again, thank you to everyone. Thank you to Beth. Thank you to Hiba. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your days, and I'll be getting out the recording and everything to you within the next week. Wonderful. Okay. Goodbye, everyone.